Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Group 15's presentation of the Emancipation Proclamation. While the original start of the war was not about slavery, equality, or freedom, the original start of the war was about reuniting the nation. Although issuing the Emancipation Proclamation was something that was in line with Lincoln's moral values, as well as the abolitionists and radical Republicans that met with Lincoln shortly after the war started, Lincoln was hesitant about issuing an anti-slavery decree so soon after the start of the war because he needed support from the Northern Democrats as well as the neutral border states. So that led Lincoln to running a war campaign that was more focused on reuniting the nation rather than on slavery. Lincoln also believed that as President of the United States of America, that his ultimate goal and duty was to preserve the Union and the nation at any cost. So much so that when he issued the proclamation, he would have allowed the southern states to return as slaveholding states just to keep the nation unified. In other words, if the southern states had returned to the nation within the 100-day grace period of the proclamation, they would have allowed to keep the slaves that they had. While the border states would have had to have gotten rid of their states, southern states would have been allowed to keep their slaves. And Lincoln was so into trying to justify that the war was not about race, he would turn down the African-American the African Americans that would come and try to enlist in the army because they wanted to fight against the slavery of the South. Lincoln didn't want them in there because that would be used as a justification for the South and the Northerners that didn't support the war, that it was about race and equality, and that's something, at least in the North, they didn't want to get behind. And for the South, it was a threat to their everyday way of life. So as the war went on, moods did change about what was considered fair and equal, at least in the way of African Americans, and that led to division amongst the Union generals. So while some of them still had traditional views of belief of African Americans in slavery and would return any captured slaves they had on the battlefield back to their original owners, while others, such as Benjamin Butler, would keep their caught slaves as contraband and hire them into the army and pay them to do the housekeeping works of laundry, dishes, things like that for the war. So the African Americans that were caught with people such as Benjamin Butler were happy to do so because they were allowed to join the army, and they saw it, even though they were doing housekeeping work, they saw it as a way to help aid the fight against the South and their slavery. And this division amongst the generals caused some issues for Lincoln because he wasn't running a unified army, trying to fight to reunite a nation, so that balance wasn't working out. And so in 1861, Lincoln decided Congress and representatives passed the Compensation Act, which was a way to keep the North unified, and its main goal was a prototype to the Emancipation Proclamation. The Compensation Act will be talked about later, but basically it's unifying all the generals under an idea such as Benjamin Butler, to where any captured slaves were treated as contraband, and you could hire them to do the housekeeping work of your armies. So when it came to officially enacting the Emancipation Proclamation, there was a few steps and forerunners to it. And as mentioned earlier, Benjamin Butler, with his original ideas of treating slaves as contraband, and the Compensation Act, which ran as the official prototype to the proclamation. If the Compensation Act would have gotten a different reaction from the nation, such as backlash and hate, then it would have changed how the proclamation was written and could have caused it to not even be written in the first place. And while enacting both the act and the proclamation, Lincoln faced risk. of course, like anything. But those two acts and proclamations in particular have a face of running and being called unconstitutional, because it's written in the Constitution that people have a right to own their slaves, while the act and the proclamation were both going against slavery. And he faced the risk the public, and if the public didn't call the act unconstitutional, he still ran the risk of them flat out denying and rejecting these, and that would have changed the whole plan for the proclamation as well as the course of the war. And the set stage for Lincoln's War was important because, or not the set stage for Lincoln's War, but rather the set stage for Lincoln issuing the proclamation was an important scene because it followed the Battle of Antietam, which was the single bloodiest day in the Civil War. And issuing the proclamation right after that on the 22nd of September in 1863 was a way for Lincoln to show that this war, the meanings has changed and we need to end this war. It was a way for Lincoln to use it as justification that, see, this is no longer about reuniting the nation and more of trying to free a people that have been oppressed. So that stage of the battle was important for Lincoln and as a way of justifying his proclamation. And yet another one where the Battle of Antietam was justifying the Emancipation Proclamation. The outlook on another important speech that Lincoln, this one was a law, but it was a speech that Lincoln gave, was very important. That's the Gettysburg Address. It was a short address. It was less than 300 words, and it was given in November of 1863 as a way to remember the lives lost during the battles of Gettysburg. Lincoln wasn't the main speaker of this event. He was thrown in more of as a halfway thought, and his speech lasted less than 3 minutes. But it was still significant to the point of the war. Instead of drawing influence from the Constitution, which many speakers at the time had done, Lincoln drew his influence from the Declaration of Independence, quoting the line, "All men are created equal," because that by going to the Declaration of Independence, he's going to the very core original foundation of this country, rather than something that's more of a do this, do that list, or you can do this and you can't do that list with the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence is one of freedom, one of hope, one of equality, all of which those were the core fighting, with the core what the Civil War was about. And so by quoting the Declaration of Independence, Lincoln is more able to change the public's perspective on what the war was about. And the proclamation and primarily the Gettysburg Address, were both a plea for equality, as said, and as a plea to end the war, to say, look how many lives have been lost. These lives are your family, your friends, your neighbors, people you care about. We're all one nation fighting each other, and that needs to end. Changing the whole course of the war from a fight of unification to a fight of equality and of freedom.
The Confiscation Act of 1861 was a well-developed way to acknowledge the Southern slaves into a free society. The act was signed and approved on August 6, 1861 by President Abraham Lincoln. The Northern leader signed this act not only to save the lives of Southern refugees, but to create new lives. The act was mainly identified as Southern slaves are not forced to go back to their masters in the South and are now thought as people in the North. jobs and camps were created by Northern armies to help support the young and educate the slaves in need. One camp, known as Circa, which was former Women's Sinister, was created in 1863 and had the nickname Slabtown. Slabtown came from the creation of jobs for slaves. These jobs, such as butchers, marketers, and salesmen, helped bring the idea of wages for the much hard put-in work these slaves had. Once educated to the max and ready to help another job that was highly supported were the thousands of colored men who formed the colored troops and helped fight alongside the North to battle the South. These men fought hard in battles and proved their strengths and learning capabilities as they fought off the South. The colored troops should always be remembered, as there is a movie called Glory in 1989 produced by Freddie Fields. I believe this movie plays a perfect role in showing you the Confiscation Act and how it was brought into the society. It helped me learn that at first the Northern Army did have a racist view of colored people, even though they were fighting for their freedom. As the colored got stronger, the Northern society was filed wrong and assumed that the strong African Americans were now their allies. In conclusion, this act was signed with perfect timing and much care that President Lincoln will now go down as an executor and a great leader. The American society only grew from these northern armies and the idea of them putting in the work to work alongside people that they did not want to work with. And now it just worked out perfectly that the free and the win combine.
The Emancipation Proclamation was issued on January 1st, 1863 by President Abraham Lincoln during the third year of the Civil War. It was the official document stating that all slaves were considered free. However, the document was only enforced towards states of active rebellion. Confederate states such as Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri were not under the Union and therefore did not have to follow the proclamation. Also, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free slaves nor end slavery. It did, however, allow runaway slaves to not be returned to their owners, and it also allowed them to join the army. It was used mainly as a weapon of war that brought zealousness to the Union Army, granting them the ambitions needed to win the war. And here's the document.
During this time, there were so many reactions to the emancipation. There were people on both sides, and also everyone had their opinion. Two examples come from the opposite ends of the spectrum. One from the Confederate President Jefferson Davis said that the emancipation was proof that the Confederate Army needed to continue to fight for the independence for the Confederate States. Frederick Douglass said that it was a great step in the right direction, but it did not go far enough, and that Lincoln needed to really do a lot more work. That there was problems with the border states that already strained relationships, but Kentucky was a great example of pushing even further. What we even see after 1862 is that Kentucky really rallied around and created this Confederate memory in which they went so far as to say has always been for Confederacy. So there was lots of reactions for the emancipation, but the African American people had their own reaction. They rejoiced at this decision for their steps towards freedom, although they were happy, but they were still cautious but optimistic for the future. Although even after Lincoln signed the effects wouldn't be completely complete until after the war had ended.
In this part of the presentation, we'll be talking about the relation of the movie Gangs of New York to the Emancipation Proclamation and the time of the Civil War. The movie takes place in 1863 in the town of Five Points, New York, and it gives a story of an Irish immigrant and his ultimate plan of revenge for his father's death from a territorial battle in the area when he was young. The movie gives an accurate representation of the actions and viewpoints of the Northern working class towards African Americans, the Civil War, and the draft riots in certain portions of the movie. African Americans were extremely berated on sight and even attacked because the working class thought the Civil War and the draft was their fault for wanting to become free and equal. Also shown is the discrimination and separation of African Americans from certain places, like the theater house and the church scene, in which the white men, even the Irish, who were also discriminated against, yelled and screamed at the African Americans present to leave the premises. Now, the draft riots were shown from Amsterdam's perspective and told by him in parts of the movie. He was receiving a form to join the Union Army earlier in the movie, but since he was involved with the gang and was basically a working classman, he didn't want to join. And he crumpled up the paper and threw it away while other men either waited in line to sign up or they yelled against the draft as Amsterdam walked away, and that was representative of how people in the North viewed the Civil War. Later in the movie, the draft riots are much more highlighted and detailed, with the scene of the drafting office calling out names, and then the working classmen going on a rampage, breaking everything, burning everything, and yelling in opposition to the rich man's war. And then after, there are even more break-ins and burnings of the mayor's house, boarding houses for soldiers, and of the gun store to get weapons. They can even go on more rampages. And that was to show that they greatly opposed the draft and the war itself. This movie gives a very accurate depiction of how the Northern working class viewed the Civil War and ultimately their opposition to the Emancipation Proclamation and the equality it gives African Americans. In conclusion, the Emancipation Proclamation changed the purpose of the Civil War into a fight for equality and freedom, from originally just trying to keep the South part of the nation. And it is a significant historical document because it allowed slaves to become free in the southern states and take a step towards becoming equal to the other men in the country. And it helped the Union win the Civil War with the help of the freed slaves. And that is all.